Today, we're talking about something a little bit different. Yes, I could be talking about the disaster that is Battlefield 2042. I could be playing Halo Infinite multiplayer right now. I could be working on some longer-term projects. I could be finishing top 10 overrated games, but no, I don't feel like doing any of that, to be honest with you. I don't even care if nobody watches this video, because I wanted to make this. Because I love 3D platformers, even if I know for a fact most of you don't. So today, we're going to talk about some obscure 3D platformers. I don't dare call them hidden gems per se, because some of these are going to be a little bit more popular than others, but I can guarantee you probably haven't played at least one game on this list. So if you're the type who loves the genre, this is for you. And yeah, there's no real qualifiers for this list, except that it obviously can't be popular. And what does that really mean? I don't know, but if you're expecting like Hat in Time to be on this list, even that is definitely a bit too well known. We're going to be digging a little bit deeper than that. So before we get into this, do the things the algorithm likes, especially for a video like this that I know for a fact most of my regular viewers probably won't watch. And feel free to tell me your favorite 3D platformer in the comments. I'll start. Mine is obviously Spyro the Dragon. If you've seen any of my streams or watched some of my older videos, I've mentioned that a few times now. And yes, it is also my favorite game of all time. And if your answer is Super Mario Odyssey, you actually will be banned from the channel. I'm not joking this time. This video is dedicated to Scrimblow Bimblow, the beloved Scrunko. So starting off this list is actually a game that released fairly recently, and that's Demon Turf. Now Demon Turf is actually a little bit different from most other 3D platformers in that it is mostly linear, but it's not in the style of Crash Bandicoot. Essentially, it controls a lot like Super Mario 64. You have a basic jump, side jump, triple jump, and there's a glide mechanic that if you use while on the ground, essentially is also a long jump. There are also a couple mechanics that are not from Mario games, like a double jump and a very short glide. On top of this, you can also manifest these energy fists, which push enemies, because there is combat in this game, and it's terrible. It's not as bad as a game later on this list, but somehow, it's actually worse in this game just because it grinds the gameplay to a halt for something that's just not fun. But what is fun are the upgrades that you get at each boss fight, which you get a hook shot, the ability to turn into a sort of snake wheelie, like from Kirby, which lets you move really fast and control sort of like a car. You can also turn into a raven and glide a lot more like Spyro. And right near the end of the game, you get the ability to slow down time in bubbles. So I'd say overall the game controls pretty well, maybe a little bit slow, but you do get a badge that allows you to walk faster, and these badges are just minor upgrades. Well, what about the actual platforming and level design? Is that at least good? The platforming itself is, but the levels really aren't. I'd say this is the weakest element of the game, and that's a serious problem when it comes to platformers. I would argue level design is just as important, if not more important, than the actual controls in a platformer. And the problem is they opted to go for a linear platformer. So what this means is there's no real exploration. Sure, there's secret areas where these cakes are hidden in the levels, and I appreciate that, though you're given an arrow that points toward the nearest suite, so that kind of eliminates that small bit of exploration, but I guess that's better than just banging your head against a wall and wasting even more time in these levels. But other than that, the majority of them are essentially straightforward platforming challenges, but the game takes too long to get challenging. And I'd say the first couple hours in a game are really important to hooking somebody. In this strange non-committal linear design, but with slightly too open levels, kind of makes the game feel lifeless in some areas, which is weird because the art style is great, but there's something about these levels that just don't click. There's exceptions. There's a level where you swim through a sewage plant. There's a level where you have to make your way through this subway, and then in between the tunnels, you have to jump from your subway across the map to the other side to another subway, and then back again to get through the level. And one of the city levels takes place inside a small city, basically, and you have to open all these different doors and do these platforming challenges where they take away some of your abilities, kind of like Sunshine, and those are good. The problem is, the entire first world's levels are mediocre and forgettable. Honestly, I couldn't tell you anything distinct about the first 7 levels of the game. Now, it does get better as it goes on, which is good. Ideally, games should get better, but you have to get past that first world to really see the best the game has to offer. I think the third world in particular, the city world, that's obviously anime inspired, is a lot more interesting. And the game gets a lot harder at that point, and then you finally start to understand the appeal of a linear 3D platformer when the platforming actually feels like it matters. And to add on to this, every level has essentially a challenge time that you have to beat for an optional collectible that just contributes toward 100% and achievements, of course. And this is one of many elements of this game that I would call padding. This is supposed to be a short review, so I'm not going to name them off, but there are a lot of different little mini games that feel very half-assed that are just not very fun. But the only padding, honestly, that probably doesn't qualify as this are the second run of each level. Basically, after you beat the boss, all the levels change into a different version, usually harder than the original, and it allows you to collect lollipops instead of cakes, which you use to buy cosmetics. And so on the one hand, that's cool because some of them really change up the original level, so it feels like a new level. On the other hand, it sucks because you can't reach the final boss until you've beaten 50 levels total, and there are 28 levels in the game, so you have to beat 22 of them again in the harder version just to get to the final boss. To make matters worse, the best levels in the game are these arcade levels that you play after you find these cartridges hidden around the world map. Now, you actually don't get anything from these levels, they're just more speedrun challenges, essentially, but each one of these levels is an homage, if not one-to-one, copied from a 3D Mario game. There's the first Bowser level from 64, there's one of the platforming challenges from Sunshine where FLUDD is taken away. There's Buoy Base Galaxy from Super Mario Galaxy, which is probably the best level in this game. And so it was really cool to see these levels, and they actually have a little bit of a twist on them for this game that makes them interesting. But the fact that they're not actual exploration levels, it's just a point A to point B time-based challenge, takes away from it a little bit. And it just makes this game's levels look shittier by comparison. But despite all of the shitting I just did on this game, believe it or not, I would still recommend it because it is fun to play. It controls well, the levels get a lot more interesting once you get to the later worlds and have these upgrades. It also has one of the best art styles I've probably ever seen in an indie game. It's very reminiscent of Paper Mario, as you can probably tell. There's a lot to like here, but there's also a lot to dislike. That's the problem. It really is just going to come down to how you feel about a 3D platformer with very little exploration. A lot of levels feel similar to one another. The game takes a while to get challenging, and it has a lot of repetitive activities that feel like padding. Because pretty much everything else about the game is good. And it really feels like you got your money's worth. There's at least 20 hours of content in this game. So at the end of the day, I would say try it. It's one of the better games I played this year, believe it or not. Alright, I might be cheating with this next one because I've actually talked about this game before already. If you remember my top 10 games you refuse to play video, one of those entries was Vexx. And for a game that's working title was probably edgy Super Mario 64, it's a surprisingly good game. Speaking of edgy, I was looking through Google, and apparently at some point in some magazine, there's a picture of Vexx killing a bunch of other fake mascot Scrimblow Bimblows, and I can't think of anything more fitting for this game. And another thing I noticed in the game is that this chick that you're helping, who's like the last of her race, her nipples are fucking poking out. This game is rated T for teen. How did they get away with this? I think for most people who grew up with video games, everybody had that one game that it felt like only you played. And Vexx is definitely that game for me. I've never met somebody else that's played this game. In fact, when it's brought up, it's often described by people as a fever dream, that you're not even sure you actually played it. And in some ways, it doesn't feel like it should be real, because it really is just edgy Super Mario 64. The story is basically a bunch of these evil dudes called Shadow Wraiths invade worlds and kill everybody and devour the life force from the world. And of course, they show up to Vexx's world and he's just some elf boy with pronounced canines. Vexx and his grandfather are forced to work in the mines. One day, Vexx decides to fight back, nearly gets killed. His grandpa is then killed in front of him by the big bad guy Dark Yabu, and his soul is somehow captured and eternally tormented by the Shadow Wraiths.
Good.
And so shortly afterward, Vexx sneaks on board one of their ships and finds the Astani War Talons, these sharp gauntlet things that shoot magical energy or whatever. And you have to go through all these worlds, collect the Wraith Hearts, which are the replacement for the stars, and it functions pretty much the same as Super Mario 64. When you get a Wraith Heart, you get kicked out of a level, and basically you just explore the levels, do unique challenges, and surprisingly, there's actually a lot of gameplay variety in this game. The basic controls are also fairly similar to Super Mario 64. There's a jump, a long jump, high jump. There's basic punches, though I guess they're more like claw swipes. And there's also some more advanced combat moves. Now, unlike the other platformers on this list that have forced combat, in Vexx, it's mostly optional. You can pretty much skip 95% of enemies in this game, and it's pretty easy to do. So to not really go into detail too much, basically you have like an uppercut, there's a flip kick that lets you juggle enemies, and juggling enemies is just extremely overpowered, especially because as you hit enemies, you build a meter, and when the meter is full, you can blast enemies with this one-hit kill homing projectile a few times. There are a few other combat moves, but honestly, it doesn't really matter too much. Enemies are just kinda there, you really don't have to fight them. But I still think that having enemies is pretty essential to a platformer. Even if you don't have to fight them, there should be some kind of opposition that adds an additional failure state, so I'm glad they're here. Honestly, what shines about this game is the level design, which is way better than you would ever expect from a middleware platformer in the 2000s, trust me. The first level is basically Bob-omb Battlefield, but much larger. Instead of climbing around a mountain, you're climbing a massive tree. Instead of King Bob-omb awaiting you on the top, it's this sumo guy who's a mini-boss of sorts, and basically you gotta knock him out of the ring. And you do fight him again later in the game, and he's got some new moves, and the arena gets smaller and smaller as you fight him, so I thought that was a pretty nice twist on it. There's also some other weird minor challenges in this level that the game is chock full of these sort of things, like you have to kick a soccer ball into a goal to get one of the Wraith Hearts. There's also this cave that leads you into this warp room of sorts, where you have to climb this really tall vertical cylinder room or building or whatever it's supposed to be, and there's these air blaster things that try and push you down into the center, and of course there's all these other separate little narrow ledges you gotta like balance across, and there's enemies, and it's pretty cool. There's also transformations like a molten suit that makes you invincible and lets you run faster, an air suit that lets you glide. There's all sorts of stuff, honestly. The game has a lot of variety. Probably the coolest level is Tempest Manor. I believe I also talked about this in the top 10, where you're basically in a giant house, and on the ground there's a starving like T-Rex puppy thing, and so it instantly kills you if it gets too close by eating you. And they take the house concept and just run with it pretty well. One Wraith Heart has you play a game of Breakout, and you actually have to turn on the Xbox. Yeah, you can tell this game was made for Xbox first, because in all versions of the game, it's basically an Xbox. There's one where you have to jump inside a piano, which takes you to another platforming section. There's a mini-game multiplayer challenge thing inside of a fishbowl. There's one where you have to actually flush yourself down the sink. all sorts of cool stuff like that. And of course, like Super Mario 64, there's also a mini clock level as well. So I don't really have to talk about too much else with the game. Just know that it has a lot of really fun level concepts. It controls pretty well, all things considered. Not perfect, but still pretty good. There are some minor camera issues that'll come up several times in the game that did annoy me. But really, this is a great game. Way better than you would expect for a middleware game, let me just say that again. And sadly, it is one of the last games that Acclaim made before they went bankrupt. And it's sad because this game really should have got more recognition. It's probably the closest thing I've played to a hidden gem, because honestly, you never hear anybody talk about it. So yeah, I would highly recommend playing this game. You're probably going to have to emulate it. Ideally, you should probably emulate the Xbox version, which looks the best. They actually downgraded the graphics for the GameCube and PS2 versions, of which this is the GameCube version I'm showing you here. But also, Xbox emulation is not nearly as good as GameCube emulation, so I'll leave that up to you. But definitely give this one a chance. Next up on the list is a personal choice, which will become obvious in a second why. That is unfortunately just a free demo, or maybe fortunately if you don't want to spend any money, and that is Zera Myths Awaken. You could probably tell immediately as soon as I show you this gameplay that this is a Spyro clone. Though calling it a Spyro clone is a little bit disrespectful, while obviously it is heavily inspired by the PS1 trilogy, it has its own unique movement mechanics that gives it its own identity. And actually, you might have been able to guess this, but it originally was a Spyro fan game, appropriately titled Spyro 4. The basic controls are pretty much the same as PS1 Spyro. Square is charge, which is basically a run and an attack. Circle is a Sonic Blast, which is basically Spyro's fire. You can jump and glide, and also flutter after you glide to get a little bit more height. But in addition to these familiar moves, there's also acrobat mechanics. Basically, while you're charging, you can press triangle to do a sort of like handstand high jump, and you can chain this into a double jump and then your glide, and then flutter afterward as well. And these moves mix together to keep the game at a very consistent speed. You're basically always moving at run speed, which makes it feel pretty decently fast-paced for a 3D platformer. I also thought the mascot choice was pretty unique. Zera is half axolotl, which are those white salamander dudes that are kind of cute, you've probably seen before, and half bat, which would explain the gliding ability. And the Sparks replacement, I guess, is a manta ray, I'm not entirely sure. So I can't say I've ever seen a mascot that looks like this, so definitely get some points for that. And then you have the levels themselves, which are another obvious homage to PS1 Spyro. Specifically the first game, where most of the levels were a series of floating platforms that you glided between. Basically all platforming challenges. There weren't really any mini games in the original game. And yeah, it's pretty much the same here. So you're basically charging, flipping, gliding, collecting all the little shiny objects. And unfortunately, there's not much else to the game other than that. And the level design feels a little bit weaker to me for some reason. I can't really place it. It's not just the aesthetic, which just looks like they puked neon on everything. It doesn't have much of a consistent visual design, so each level theme doesn't come across too well. It certainly sells the PS1 graphical aesthetic pretty well. The very limited polygon count is obvious, but the visual design kind of feels unfocused. But on top of this, the actual levels kind of feel a little too empty. There's just not much to them, and it's hard to describe why. It's kind of missing that it factor. But again, I can let all this slide because it is a free demo. And it's been a year since the last version released, so I'm sure they've made a lot of progress on the game since then. So I'm definitely going to keep a close eye on this one. I would recommend trying it out. It's only about an hour and 20 minutes because it's only 4 levels. And if you don't care about 100%ing it, it's much shorter than even that. So yeah, give it a chance. It's pretty fun. And if you like Spyro, I guarantee you'll like this. Alright, I might be pushing the boundaries of what's considered obscure here because Vexx is not really unknown, he's more like forgotten. But honestly, most Zoomers may have not even heard of him, so this game still qualifies. So here we go, Vexx 2, Enter the Gecko. The first Vexx was a pretty standard 2D platformer, kinda mediocre for the time, much like the original Rayman. And also like Rayman, the second entry enters the world of 3D, and it's developed by Crystal Dynamics. Yes, that Crystal Dynamics. And I'll be honest, this game isn't that great. I actually remember it being better than it is. Sadly, it hasn't aged that well. Basically, it's a combination linear and exploratory platformer, but honestly kind of in the worst way possible. The levels are mostly linear, but sometimes have multiple paths that you can go down, and in each level you need to get to these platforms that have these remotes, which are the star of the game, and each level is basically some kind of theme, said theme being some kind of genre from media, like there's a Looney Tunes inspired level, there's a spooky haunted mansion level that's enemies are obviously references to horror films, and so on. The problem with this game honestly mostly lies with the controls, and that is a serious problem. I don't think I need to explain to you why having bad controls in a game is bad, but somehow it's even worse in a platformer considering platforming is mostly all you do. You'll understand why once I explain the controls. They're pretty simple. It has 8 directional movement, so that gives me the suspicion that this was either made for D-pad or specifically the N64's analog stick, which were both limited to 8 directions. You have a standard jump, which surprisingly doesn't go very far. A decent height, just not a lot of distance. There's a second higher jump you can do after the first jump, by pogo sticking off your tail, and unfortunately this is required for a lot of jumps, as for some reason even basic platforming is kind of tight in this game. Too tight, really, to be honest with you. They don't even feel like they're hard jumps necessarily. It's just combined with the low frame rate and the limited movement, and sometimes even just the bad camera gives you a false sense of perspective. Seriously, I had like multiple times in this game where my depth perception fell off just because the camera angle is just at that perfect, like low isometric angle and you really can barely turn it. There's many times in this game where the camera is fixed and you can't move it, so that in itself is a huge problem. But combine this with the fact that you need that higher jump, and there's also a long jump, which actually feels pretty decent, but you can't control its trajectory in mid-air. So once you pick the direction, you're stuck in that direction, so you can very easily long jump off a cliff. You also have a basic tail whip, and both the long jump and the pogo jump count as an attack. So luckily, the combat is pretty easy, and yes, this is yet another platformer that thought it was a good idea to have forced combat sections. Thankfully, there's only a few of them, but you're likely going to be killing a lot of enemies because one of the types of remotes that's in every level is the collectible one, where essentially you have to collect 120 of that level's respective coin, and enemies drop collectibles, so you're going to be killing a lot of them. But then the other biggest problem in the game is the level design. Like I said, it's partially open, mostly linear. And the problem with this is that when you grab a red remote, it kicks you out of the level, which means you're gonna have to do the exact same linear paths multiple times to get all of the collectibles, which I don't need to tell you is boring. Stack this on top of several of these levels having this same challenge, which is break this weird thing that's in every level. Like in the horror level, you have to break blood coolers. In the Looney Tunes level, you have to break these purple mushrooms. And it's just boring and uncreative. And the same goes for the enemies as well. They all have very simple AI. There's either one that just bounces, another one that chases after you and hurts you on contact, and then there's these ninja guys that can throw ninja stars and stuff, but that's pretty much it. All of them are just a reskin of 3 or 4 enemy types. But the weird part is, everything else in the game is decently fun. If you can get past the annoying camera and the weirdly tight jumps, you can still have a decent time, really. Another small thing, that might bother some people, but I don't really care about it that much, is that Vexx is one of those characters that makes quips.
Tail time! Tail time!
Yeah. Say
Tail time!
again, I dare you, I double dare you, motherfucker!
And all of his quips are references to things from the 80s and 90s. And now normally that would be fine if a lot of them were just the most popular culture from the time. I mean, I'm sure you'll recognize references to The Shining or Star Wars or the Austin Powers impression that is greatly overused. There's even a joke about SNL that still fits today.
In a land before time, when Saturday Night Live was funny.
But then for every one of those references, there's weirdly obscure shit or like really old stuff, and there's even a couple vaguely homophobic references too. I don't have a problem with them, they're just not that clever. So that's a lot of stuff that you have to get past to get to the serviceable gameplay and level design. So I can definitely only really recommend this game to the most hardcore platforming fans.
I know what you're thinking. It's tail time.
The next scrimblow on the list is Spark the Electric Jester 2. The first one was a 2D Sonic clone, but a pretty damn good one, honestly. I was impressed by the game. Not quite as good as Freedom Planet, but definitely worth playing if you like those older Sonic games. But I've always been a bigger fan of the Sonic Adventure games, so naturally, the second game in this series is a clone of Sonic Adventure 2. The level design feels straight out of Adventure 2 or Sonic Heroes, at least the better Sonic Heroes levels. And it controls very similarly, but with a few added mechanics for better or worse. Obviously, you can run pretty fast, jump, homing attack. There's an instant spin dash, which is much better than either the boost mechanic or spin dash from the older games, because there's no limitation on it. You just press the button and you're instantly back to running speed. There's a melee attack and a block/counter, which are part of the new combat system, which is probably the worst part of the game, to be frank with you, because unfortunately, it is an integral part of the score system, and every boss fight in this game obviously involves these mechanics. And to explain them quite simply, you have a basic light melee, which is probably all you're going to be using, and the parry can be used at any time because it's a shield, so you can still do it while attacking enemies. And if you block an attack right before they hit you, you parry them, and it builds up your melee damage multiplier. There's also a heavy attack, which is unique to each of the power-ups, of which there are several power-ups that you can equip 3 at a time and swap between them, and there's 5 or 6 total in the game. I don't remember exactly how many. But 3 of the power-ups are just melee weapons. One extends your dash, and another one allows you to summon a motorcycle when you use your strong attack, which functions similarly to the boost, but I didn't really use it that much. Maybe there's some other use. I probably don't even have to say this, but obviously the appeal of this game is running really fast in a straight line. Thankfully, the level design is a little bit more complex than that. This is something maybe more akin to Sonic Adventure 1, and the prototype stage for that game as well, where there are multiple pathways that lead to the same goal. So there is some variation in how you tackle a stage. There's also a decent amount of replayability, because of course, there is a score, and to get a high score, you have to defeat enemies and collect all the shiny objects without getting hit to build up your multiplier. And that multiplier stacks pretty high. I think it goes up to 20. Maybe it goes even higher than that. I don't know. I never got that high. But it's safe to say that the multiplier is the most important thing to the score. The only thing you have to watch out for is that if you take too long to complete the level, your score instantly goes to 0. Now, there are a few things I really don't like about this game. The first of which is the combat. And yeah, it's incredibly simplistic. You're basically just mashing square as much as possible while looking out for the very obvious telegraphing that the enemies have, and then you just hit L1 to parry the attack and keep pressing square the entire time. And this even extends to the boss battles, which are absolute dog shit for this very reason. Every single boss, all I did was keep pressing square over and over again, never stop pressing square, and then just hitting L1 at the right timings. The only good part about them is that you can beat them all in less than 1 minute, so I guess it's not that bad. But they really should have went back to the drawing board on this, especially since The only difference between each boss is some of the attack timings, and some of them have unblockable moves. That's it. And one thing I do want to mention, and it is without a doubt the worst part of this game, is the story. Oh my god, it is so cringe. It's like some kind of terrible combination of every generic shonen anime in terms of the dialogue writing, and the actual story itself is something straight out of Shadow the Hedgehog, combined with Gamma's story from Adventure 1. I don't want to describe it in detail, really, because these are meant to be short reviews, but honestly, I could talk about the shitty-ass story in this game for like 10 minutes on its own. It is embarrassingly bad. I don't know, I'd say overall it was still pretty fun. It's not exactly a long game, you could probably beat it in 2 hours. But yeah, if you're looking for a 3D Sonic game that's reminiscent of the good days of Sonic, which honestly might be debatable, but I enjoyed those games anyway, then yeah, Sparks the Electric Jester 2, I'd recommend it for sure. So yeah, this conclusion may seem like it's coming out of nowhere because honestly I didn't know what the scope of this video was going to be going in. But yes, I've now decided this is probably going to be a series of sorts where I look into various genres, pick out 5 interesting, lesser known games. I'm not going to go super obscure. I know some of you people like those channels that just pick the most obscure shit that nobody's heard of and then cover it for 30 minutes. Honestly, most of the time those games aren't even worth playing. Not calling anybody out, but I feel like 80% of the time I watch those videos, they're not actually that fun when you sit down to play them. So out of these 5 games, 4 of them are a solid recommendation, and on the request of my brother, I will rank them for you here. This is purely based on what I consider to be the quality of the game. If I was rating based on the scrimblow factor of them, this would be a much different list. I think there's a lot better Skrunkos from the 90s than now. Worst one is definitely Vexx 2, without a doubt. It's not a bad game, but it has way too many problems, and it feels very dated. Next is Zera Myths Awaken, which is probably gonna piss somebody off, I know, but it's just not finished. There's a lot of potential there, don't get me wrong. I look forward to seeing the early access release, but as it stands, it's just a free demo you can enjoy for an hour, so it doesn't really deserve a higher spot, hate to say it. Number 3 is Demon Turf. This is a game I really wanted to be better, but the weak level design really hurts it. The decision to go fully linear but simultaneously make most of the early levels not very interesting or difficult definitely hurt the game. Second half of the game is much better, but at the end of the day, it still felt like it was missing something. Though I really do adore the art style, so it gets a little bit of credit for that. Still a fun game. Number 2 is actually Spark the Electric Jester 2. I was surprised how much fun I had with this game given how simplistic it is and how cringy the story is and how kind of annoying the combat is. But as an homage to Sonic Adventure 2, it does a pretty damn good job. I thought the level design was really interesting in some places. The score mechanic where you mix going really fast with killing a bunch of enemies and getting as many collectibles as possible struck a pretty nice balance that doesn't just prioritize getting to the goal as fast as possible like a speedrunner. And it's a fairly unique game because they don't really make games like the Sonic Adventure games anymore. Sure, you could maybe make a comparison to the Boost saga of games, as they like to call it, but the gameplay style is not the same, and level design almost feels like an afterthought in those games, whereas in this, it's a big part of the platforming, and really adds to the challenge. I would recommend grabbing it on sale though, because it really is only 2 hours long, but I had a really good time with it. And number 1, of course, is the nostalgia pick, Vexx. This game always impresses me with how good it actually is, because it shouldn't be good. It really shouldn't. It's the Shadow the Hedgehog of Super Mario 64. Why would that be a good game? I don't know. It's a good game because a lot of heart was put into it, honestly. The level design is so creative. The gameplay variety is way above average for a 3D platformer, while actually still being fun, unlike a lot of Spyro 3, to call out a specific example that comes to my head. And really, it is a hidden gem, truly. I don't care if it doesn't fit the definition, if it's slightly too popular. but I don't think it's popular enough to be a cult classic, so I'm just gonna call it a hidden gem, and that's what it is. It's a great game that got very little attention, and the company that made it went bankrupt, so pretty sad, honestly. I would definitely recommend you check it out. And yeah, there goes episode 1 of hopefully a new series. Obviously, this took quite a bit of work, so I'm not going to do this that often, but do the things the algorithm likes if you want to see more videos like this. Especially since it probably won't get that many views, since I know most of you guys don't care about 3D platformers, though you probably didn't even click on this video anyway, so preaching to the choir, I guess. Not sure what next video is gonna be. Probably a video game awards video, which I will most likely stream, because I imagine that won't take too much effort, and I'm sure we're all gonna have a good time laughing or cringing at this year. So, look forward to that. Then I'll talk about Halo Infinite. So that's it. I'll see you next time, guys.